All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So today we'll just be doing a little continuation of Hinduism. We'll be talking about Hindu idealism specifically today. Before I get into it, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in again, and also for all the kind emails I've received for my recovery. It's been going really well, so I definitely appreciate all the kind words. And yeah, and I'll be back next week and should be in 110% ready to go. So I'm definitely excited for that. And yeah, so that's about it. So I guess we'll just jump right in again. The excerpt for today was a little bit shorter than was for Tuesday. So I guess kind of proportionate to that, the video will be a bit shorter as well, since there's just not that much material to cover. I think that's about it, so I'll just jump right in. So today we are doing Hindu idealism, as I've already said. It's a continuation of the Upanishads that we talked about last time. Since these are Upanishads, they are probably the oldest philosophical texts that are known to man. And I guess based off these texts, there were a lot of different interpretations of them, right? So from here, in Hinduism, they actually separated into 6 different schools. So that being I apologize for the pronunciation, but the Sankhya, the Yoga, the Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, the Mimamsa, and then finally, what we'll be talking today, the Vedanta. So the Vedanta, it very much goes. I guess it takes the Vedas and the Upanishads very strictly as the authoritative text, and it definitely builds upon that kind of that mystical self that the Upanishads was talking about, and tries to really refine that in a way. And so the person I'm talking about today, his name is Shankara. He's from the 8th century BC. 8th century AD. And he's part of the non-dualist Vedanta school. So it's called the Advaita Vedanta. Got it right up here. So it's worth noting. So the Vedanta school, there's the dualists, right, who do believe in the mind-body separation, right? That ultimately self and Brahman are distinct, and that self or Atman, that we ultimately have very limited access to Brahman. And I think it's worth noting in the Upanishads, they really didn't talk about much, the distinction between Atman and Brahman. And so here, Shankara definitely does this and makes it more clarified for those who are seeking this path. The non-dualist school, which is what we'll be talking about today, they do believe actually that the self and Brahman are the same thing, right? That pretty much, that we can attain this mystical knowledge that in realizing, I guess, the true nature of the self, that we do come in communion with Brahman, and that we can actually, realize Brahman in its fullest potential. Going off the notion of non-dual, I guess goes with that is the notion of idealism. So for those who remember, we talked about idealism in Chinese philosophy with Xuanzang, and he was a Buddhist idealist. So you'll definitely see some similarities, between the Hindu idealist and the Buddhist idealist schools. But there's also, one main distinction that I really want to make clear that separates them, although they both are considered idealist schools. And so just a reminder, or idealism in general, is the fact that, if you remember with Xuanzang, that everything external to the self and to the mind is, I guess, all dependent on the mind, right? That any external objects or entities, that these are ultimately constructed by the mind, and they don't have any real existence outside of the mind. So this is worth noting as well. So it's worth noting as well that the Advaita Vedanta school, they also do believe in a type of monism. So it's monism is contrary to dualism, right? Think of Descartes with the mind-body separation, and as well as the dualist Vedanta school. But monism in general is that the world consists of only one kind of thing. That there's some, there's one fundamental element or particle that kind of makes up of everything. A couple of examples is think of, we didn't talk about him that much in detail, but Democritus, ancient Greek philosopher who believed in atomism, which was the notion that everything was constructed out of atoms, right? And that the atom was the fundamental particle that made up all of existence, which is a pretty interesting view, just how old ancient Greek philosophy is compared with modern science. We haven't talked about him that much with Berkeley. He thought that everything consisted of ideas, right? He did believe in a type of idealism. And then Xuanzang, right, if we remember, that he believed, that the only thing that exists, or that existed truly were kind of the mental constituents of our consciousness, right? The storehouse consciousness. He had all these different types of consciousness that played into that. But so for the Advaita Vedanta school, they actually believed in a much more radical type of monism, which I would like to consider right here, absolute monism, which is the notion that the world isn't just constructed of one type of thing, but that actually the world is one thing in itself. So again, I really like the ocean metaphor to portray this, right? That the waves, they are just manifestations, or I guess analogous to the different differentiated phenomena in the world, but ultimately they're all rooted in the ocean, and that they are I guess necessarily connected to the ocean, and this makes the whole world kind of one living organism. And I think that's a really good way to kind of understand the Hindu metaphysical picture that the world is just one large breathing organism, that we're merely, I guess, manifestations of that organism. So if that makes it a little clearer from last time. Right, and so here's the big difference between Buddhist idealism and Hindu idealism. Is in Buddhist idealism, it's the world is completely dependent on the mind, but it's on our own, our own consciousness, right? Our own individual consciousness. They do believe in no self, right? But they don't have this notion in Hinduism, which is kind of this collective consciousness, right? That looking at the self, in any way as some individuated, separated from the rest of the things around us, in Hinduism would be kind of falling prey to delusion, which they call Maya. So I have right here, ultimately there's two, so reality in Vedanta is just completely, constructed by Brahman, and I guess us seeing things as differentiated are merely dreams of Brahman. So which is still connected to Brahman. So you could again use the waves in the ocean to portray this. Right, that as we know, the senses tend to deceive us, and the world is constantly in flux, right? So we can't go to the world for indubitable knowledge, right? That it more rests inside of us, doing meditation, yoga, especially for Vedanta, and kind of that's how we gain this, I guess, indestructible knowledge, right? That's rooted in something very stable and unchanging, despite on the surface it appears changing. And he makes this distinction that the dreams of Brahman, right, is the very common sense view of the world, right? It's a very practical view. I mean, we kind of individuate entities to, for very practical reasons. But ultimately, all this differentiation, which is very similar to Chinese Buddhism, Xuanzang, where all these are kind of just conceptual we conceptually discriminate these entities in this, and in thinking that the world is inherently divided like this. It is a product of illusion and ultimately of Maya, which is the Sanskrit word for illusion. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, this is very, very familiar from a lot of what we talked in Chinese philosophy, that, yeah, words make the world appear, separated. Language, right, the subject-object distinction, we talked, we brought that up very many times and discussed it, and remember, with the subject-object, like, I have some examples right here. So I dislike poison ivy. We separate I and poison ivy as two distinct things, with the dislike as the relationship between me and the poison ivy. Or language utilizes words, right? We create this, this differentiation between language and words, and the connection is how that language utilizes words. And then also the subject-predicate relationship, where trees grow branches, right? These are kind of these are properties of certain objects or subjects that we treat as, as we saw in the West, right, where they treat these qualities and these properties as, remember, the universals, right? Greenness, they treat these as, individuated entities that are attributed to many different things, but they do exist in themselves, these qualities. Yeah, so see if there's anything worth, I guess, yeah, that, words, right, in the conventional view, it's very superficial. And although it's very practically applicable, right, that, looking at everything as part of ourself seems a bit silly, in everyday life. That ultimately, Atman and Brahman are the same thing. And so it is worth talking about. So I think, got over that. So I might as well just move to the next board. So I will be talking a lot on this board. So the big thing for Shankara in the excerpt we have today, it was the Brahma Sutra commentary by Shankara, and his big concept in here is superimposition, right? So the definition of superimposition, I have it here. So it's to place over another, yet both are still evident. So so here's some contemporary examples. I guess for one example is when you watch a movie, in the beginning they place the credits over the opening scene, right? So you can see, who created the movie, who's acting in it. But you can also see what's going on in the very beginning stages of the movie. This is an example of superimposition. Another one is, this is a very contemporary example, which is Snapchat filters. You have you there, and then they have all these crazy things that you can kind of adjust to your face, and superimposes certain filters on that. And so that's pretty much what superimposition is. So this is what Shankara, his exact definition. He says here, so it's the apparent presentation in the form of remembrance to consciousness of something previously observed in some other thing. Or put in other words, the apparent presentation of the attribute of one thing in another thing. Right. So, superimposition is just kind of placing something over the world, right? Where we can think of, placing concepts, placing language over the world to understand it, right? But do these concepts ultimately represent the world as it is? And for Shankara, he would say no, right? These universals, that Plato was so keen on, that he thought we could use these universals to achieve, knowledge that could be used for progress, right? For rational progress, for the betterment of human society, in harmony in general. That for Shankara, these are these qualities, greenness, treeness, chairness. They are maybe things we can use again for practical reasons, right? But they ultimately, inherently aren't part of the world. They're more just a tool that we use to understand it. And this kind of extends as well to seeing opposites as contraries, which we're very familiar with the yin and yang, right? Light and dark are different, but as we learned in Chinese philosophy, you need one to have the other exist, and vice versa, right? This extends to cause and effect, right? Where we see certain things cause something else, and then we kind of attribute in our mind, we attribute to the world that whenever one thing will happen, necessarily the next thing will. But again, Shankara, he realizes this is only in the mind that we make these connections that, based on kind of the contingency of the world, where, i.e. the unpredictability, that sometimes when one thing happens, another thing will not. And Shankara is just really pointing out kind of the limited scope of, I guess, language in general, this conceptual discrimination that we commonly do in our everydayness, right? In kind of thinking that these things apply for the Vedanta school, thinking that these things apply inherently to the world, right? That these words that we use, that they are manifest in the external objects themselves. This leads to us being trapped in ignorance or illusion, again, which is considered Maya, right? And so Brahman and Atman, right? These actually, conceptually they seem separate, right? The words are different, so therefore they kind of indicate different things. But ultimately, they, peeling back from the words, they ultimately are the same thing. And this is this ultimate realization that Shankara wants you to realize, right? Through, as we know, yoga, meditation, reflection, in not a rational sense, right? Reflection, intellectually. So here's I think another difference between Hindu idealism and Buddhist idealism, is that in Buddhist idealism, right, that knowledge, it's we're taught to discard it, right? But in Hindu idealism, knowledge is actually a necessary component to having this realization that Atman and Brahman, our truest inner self, we are actually manifestations of God's essence, which God and Brahman are the same thing. And if you remember, again, God in this context is, this living organism of the universe, right? That's constantly moving, constantly changing, right? This life force that's manifesting within everything. This is God for Hinduism, right? It's not some transcendental God, which I hope I made clear in the last video. So pretty much, so we're on the subject object. We're very similar with this. And what I got out of the text generally is that so typically we are the subject, and we tend to superimpose a self upon ourself, and a non-self to objects, right? And this is falling into Maya, into ignorance. When we attribute a self to ourself, we attribute some individuated, separated existence that constitutes ourself. And this is not right, because in the Vedanta school, self is actually everything, right? This collective sense of self, where we're all God's self in a way. Even suffering is considered self, God's self. And you may wonder, well, I guess this God in Hinduism isn't a very benevolent person or whatever it is. And I think it is true. It's a very, indifferent God, perhaps. But it is this just embodiment of the world as a breathing, living entity. I don't know if you could say organism, but maybe that's worth debating over. But we constantly superimpose these labels to each side, and in this way we fall into Maya. And so I have over here. So this is what leads to I think it's nescience, or avidya, which is just pretty much lacking in knowledge, ignorance, and that kind of realizing that these are only superimpositions upon the subject and the object. This constitutes knowledge, right? Vidya. But I think it's worth talking about how confronting this, right? Confronting this just theoretically, in your mind is one thing, but also really confronting it with your whole being through meditation. This is, this is what the Vedanta school wants you to do, and thinks will lead to eternal bliss, and when you realize you are part of God's essence, right? And again, so I have right here, I guess it's a different portrayal of the ocean metaphor, right? So these are supposed to be waves. They're a little rough. But these waves are the dreams of Brahman, and this is our everyday consciousness of discriminating objects. This is conceptual discrimination. But that Brahman is this thing that's unchanging within it all. Even if say Earth and the human race is wiped out, the universe is nearly infinitely large, and it'll keep moving forward, right? This, what I guess time would be the embodiment of this living organism of Brahman, and that this is actually unchanging, right? This this essence that's making things move, right? We've never had a time where things have just stopped, right? Stopped in time, which I think I've seen a lot of movies where future science potentially could go back in time, but as far as we know, have yet to reach these boundaries, and time is just kind of this thing that keeps flowing forward, just keeps going and never stops, and this is the part that's always unchanging. The fact that things are changing is the notion that whatever's causing this change is unchanging, right? That's generally what I got out of the text. I guess, let's see. It talks about, this is, you've heard of this before, the true self, it's not consisted of the senses or the body, right, or perception, not of rationality, not of even some kind of the storehouse consciousness, which is what Swan Song was all about. Our true self is actually this collective self of being God's essence, right? And that in realizing this is actually when knowledge can operate in a right fashion. Is when we kind of have a knowing personality, as he says. There must be a knowing personality for right knowledge to operate. So, and I think this is also a last note that's worth kind of talking about is, so again, which is really interesting, in the East they never talk about rationality. He actually talks about how men and animals are very similar in the text. How we both we have certain sensations that we react to. He talks about the cow, how the cow is approached by somebody with a stick, and usually it'll move away in fear of being beaten. Or if there's someone approaches the cow with grass, the cow will approach the person, being hungry. And then men do very similar things, albeit we have a much more complex. It's a much more complex situation, and we have a higher intelligence in general. But we still have these reactions to certain combinations of sensations that we receive. And in this way, I think, so it's talking about, I think this metaphor is really pushing the notion that, realizing that everything is part of yourself, it would just be silly to apply that to our everydayness, to our conventional, how we kind of, demarcate between objects for practical reasons, right? To go about our day and to go about our day successfully, right? And we also, we have natural, I think, instinctual drives that, kind of talk about how our self, is something within this body, right? So it's not worth ignoring those, those facts. But it's Vedanta is really going for this kind of intellectual grasp on the fact that, although we have this conventional notion of self, consummately, right, that we are, not individuated selves, but part of a larger self, which is just this living, breathing, this ocean, right? That we're just, again, I know I've used it a lot, but we're just oceans on the wave, and in this way we shouldn't fear death, right? Because in a way, although we don't have individual souls that will be reincarnated, we'll still be reincarnated, because whatever's causing this change is unchanging, right? So that's pretty much it. I think superimposition is really important for Shankara, and you can get. We did talk a lot about this in Chinese philosophy, so this is kind of just a general recap. But again, it's really worth noting that this collective sense of self is very unique to Hinduism, and I think it's a really interesting view of the world in general. So looking through my notes, I think that is about it. Yeah, so I think that's about it. So I'll just leave it there. Again, I'll have a little quiz at the end of this. I'll put it on iLearn a little bit. It'll be shorter because, again, the video will be a little shorter as well. If you have any questions about this, feel free to shoot me an email, or for those who have an extension for their essay tomorrow, if you have any questions about that, you know how to contact me. I think that's it. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Really do appreciate it, and hope you have a swell weekend, and see you next week.